different countries around the world have done on climate change legislation. Let's see. Okay. So, I think as Tash has mentioned, over the past 20 years, we have seen remarkable growth in the use of climate legislation as the key policy tool to advance objectives for ambitious climate action. So at our institute, for the past 6 years, we've been gathering data on all climate change and climate change related laws and policies around the world. So if we remember and look back to the time that the Kyoto Protocol was negotiated in 1997, in our database we could only find about 70 climate change related laws and policies around the world. And when I say climate change or climate change related, I mean policies and laws which directly aim to target climate change, for example, national climate strategies, or legislation which sets out national emission reduction objectives, but we also count for related legislation and policies, for example, renewable energy legislation, which directly makes a link to the objectives of decarbonization. Now, if we turn to last year, 2019, this is what we have. So our database at the moment contains, at the end of 2019, 1,800 laws and policies addressing climate change or directly related to it. And what is very interesting, there has been remarkable growth, in particular in developing countries in the past 10 years. So increasingly, governments and parliaments turn to climate legislation as an important tool, governance tool, to advance climate policy. Now, why should we use climate change legislation? Why may it not be enough to simply adopt a government strategy to address climate change? So we have asked exactly this question 2 years ago, and in particular we wanted to study the experience of the United Kingdom, which was the first country in the world in 2008 to adopt a comprehensive national climate change legislation which established a binding emission reduction target both for the long term, but also a mechanism for setting and implementing the shorter term targets that would get the country to the long term objective. So the study that we conducted wanted to understand, has climate change legislation made a difference in the UK? And if so, which difference? And what can other countries learn from that experience? So, but before I get to that, I wanted to show you an example of other countries that since 2008 adopted climate change legislation. So you can see that Mexico was the first emerging economy in 2012, which adopted a comprehensive climate change law, which was then later amended in 2018 to bring it into consistency with their nationally determined contribution to the quantitative targets that they committed under the Paris Agreement. France in 2015 adopted energy transition law, and later last year in June it was followed up with law on energy and climate, which has set a goal for climate neutrality for 2050, but there are many other countries in Europe and outside that we can learn from. So coming back to climate legislation, why is it necessary to put a climate change framework into law? So I'll give you an anecdotal story from the UK to start from. This is a picture of David Cameron, which came in the media in 2005 when he was campaigning as the leader of the Conservative Party for the Prime Minister's office. And at the time, Conservatives realized that climate change and environmental concerns are very important, in particular for young voters. Young people were increasingly concerned about environment. So he came with this picture of hugging a husky, and the slogan was "Vote Blue," which is the Conservative color, "Go Green." Now, this is a picture of David Cameron as a prime minister about a decade later, when the UK was going through austerity, leading into the austerity crisis, and that was his allegedly he was quoted to say, we've got to get rid of all this green stuff. So that demonstrates the change in the position of a politician, a very powerful politician in the country. Yet, if we look at the United Kingdom's climate policy, because climate change legislation has put into law the objectives at the time of reducing greenhouse gas emissions at least by 80% by 2050, and it has established a clear framework of intermediary steps for achieving those long-term emission reductions, which I will describe to you in a minute. The country is still committed to its climate change objectives. We will discuss some challenges on the road, but what the legislation does at the highest level, it allows to protect strategic objectives of climate change policy from potential political change and changes in preferences of ruling political parties. Now, let's talk about the UK Climate Change Act. So one of the first decisions when a country decides to embark on a task of developing a climate law is to address those two strategic points which you can see on your screen. The first, there is a need for positive narrative. Why do we need a climate change law? What benefits would a climate change legislation bring for the country? And those benefits could include, of course, reaching the climate change objectives, but they're not limited to that. They are also associated with improved local air quality, health benefits, energy security benefits through promotion of renewable energy, and a number of other benefits which are important to articulate to get support across the political spectrum. And it is important to create political momentum, a positive political momentum supporting the climate legislation. So if we look at the UK's experience, around 2007, leading up to 2007, 2008, when the debate around Climate Change Act and the potential legislation started, UK was taking a leadership role internationally. It was chairing the G7. It was also actively involved in the G20 when climate change concerns were coming up to the international agenda. It was also going through Prime Minister, the general election, and different parties were competing for the office, as I mentioned. And so all of that created an opportunity to bring climate change to the front of the political agenda, which is what actually happened. Other countries had other situations, but similarly they were managing to create political momentum. So I'll mention Mexico in 2012 when they adopted general law on climate change. Preceding to that, President Calderon at the time was about to go out of the office, and for him climate change was a very important issue that he cared about personally, and he wanted to make it part of his legacy as a president. So that was one of the drivers for him and his party to push for climate concern to be high on the agenda and to propose a climate change legislation. At the same time, Mexico was also the host of international climate change negotiations in 2009 and in 2010, sorry. So they had attention of the whole world, and they were very effective host in facilitating and reaching agreement after the failure of Copenhagen. So that has also given a positive boost to the political debate and helped create political momentum domestically. The second set of issues, strategic issues around designing climate legislation, they relate to the scope and the level of specificity and flexibility that the law should have. And again, countries take different approaches to that. So the approach of United Kingdom was that let us decide on very important strategic elements such as long-term goal, the mechanism of getting to that long-term goal, but then leave sufficient flexibility to the government to establish concrete policies outside of the legislation, so that government will have a clear mandate, the timeline, and responsibilities for coming up with policies to implement the legislation. But you separate the political debate on the legislation itself from the discussion on implementation, which makes it easier for the political negotiation to come to an agreement. Other countries, such as France, for example, they took a different approach. I will show you later. The French energy transition law has a set of very detailed targets for different sectors. So they wanted to put as much information and as much specificity into their law as possible from the beginning. And just to give you an idea, the UK law has passed in its original reading almost without any changes, with only 3 votes against it. In France, the debate on legislation has taken 2 hours of parliamentary discussions, and there were over 2,000 different pages with amendments in the course of that process, and it has taken them about 2 years to pass it through Parliament, similar in Mexico. So there are trade-offs between being very specific, leaving some flexibility, and the time and efforts it takes to adopt the legislation. Now, let me talk about UK's Climate Change Act in more detail. So on this slide, you can see the key elements of the climate change legislation, and I will go through the most important ones in more detail. So first of all, the UK Climate Change Act has set a long-term emission reduction objective covering the whole economy and all greenhouse gases, which was in the original reading up at least 80% reduction below the level of 1990 by the year 2050. And what this objective set is effectively, it has given a direction of travel for all of the key sectors of the economy, signaling very clearly that UK economy has to decarbonize by 2050. Last year, drawing on the new scientific information on the impacts of climate change being more urgent than we expected, and the emissions growing also faster, the UK government has taken a decision to revise that target to become carbon neutral by 2050. So at the moment it is 100% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, net greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, which means net zero, meaning that there will still be some emissions of greenhouse gases from some sectors, in particular agriculture and aviation remain challenging, but there would also need to be sequestration and offsetting of emissions from other sectors. Now, this is very important, and what is very interesting, because the original language of the law said at least 80% emission reductions by 2050, it meant that the legislation didn't have to go through formal amendment in the parliament. The target could be amended based on the language of at least 80% reduction. So that was a very important strategic decision to have that flexibility in the language. But for countries which do go for flexibility in the language, it is important to specify that in accordance with the Paris Agreement, the revision of target can only be towards more ambitious efforts, so that there is no scope for backsliding and backtracking on the emission reduction objective. Now, the second important element of the UK Climate Change Act is so-called carbon budgets. What is carbon budgets? Carbon budgets are effectively, it's a mechanism of determining and setting the target for each 5-year intermediate period up to 2050. So the carbon budgets are set 12 years in advance. So the first 2 carbon budgets, they were determined soon after the Climate Change Act was adopted in 2008. basically almost immediately. And then the rest of them had to be adopted 12 years ahead of time. So that ministries in the government are the key actors, such as subnational governments, municipalities, but also private sector have sufficient time in these 12 years to prepare and to adjust the investment strategy in order to be able to meet the upcoming emission reduction targets. So on this graph, you can see the level of carbon budgets up to now. This is still going to the original target of 80% up to 2050. So now with the new amended target of net zero, the future carbon budgets would have to take into account a more drastic emission reductions necessary. How does the process work? So the legislation specifies that the level of the carbon budget should be determined based on recommendation by a climate change committee, which is an independent advisory body that was created by the Climate Change Act. So this I will describe more detail about the independent advisory body, but what is important is that they are composed of experts, independent experts, which come from different technical backgrounds. So there are economists, scientists, increasingly there are also social scientists with experience in sociology and other aspects of climate change policy, which act on their own personal expert capacity. And so they provide advice to the government on what the level of carbon budget should be based on extensive modeling exercise. The government then considers that recommendation and either accepts it. So far they have accepted all of the levels of carbon budgets proposed by the Climate Change Committee. And that proposal then goes to the Parliament, which then debates on it and legislates it. So what is important, this mechanism effectively creates a flexible way. So remember when I mentioned that in the original legislation, the level of this intermediate targets is not set. That was the way, a strategic way to separate, to depoliticize the initial discussion on the overall framework that the Climate Change Act is setting with the specific discussion on targets for each specific 5-year period. But the legislation clearly specifies the timelines by which carbon budgets need to be adopted, and also the process of how they should be determined. And effectively, carbon budgets represent a progressive mechanism for ratcheting up emission reduction. So every carbon budget is more and more ambitious than the previous one, and they need to ensure that the emissions get to the level of a long-term target by 2050 of net zero. Now, the third important element of the UK Climate Change Act is that it introduced the framework for continuous adaptation planning in the UK. So the Climate Change Act requires the government to come up with climate change risk assessments for the UK every 5 years. That the risk assessment then goes to Climate Change Committee, which evaluates and comments on it, and then it needs to be followed by the National Adaptation Program, and that needs to happen every 5 years. So what we found through our research that this provision has really played a major role in introducing climate risk into the consideration of both public sector, but also private institutions, business, into their decision making. Effectively, having a UK-wide risk assessment now provides information for businesses operating in the UK, but also for government departments, where they can clearly see scenarios and projected climate impacts for the geographies where they plan their investments. And that allows to take more informed decisions about climate proofing and adapting to the impacts of climate change. Now, The fourth important element, which I have started to mention, is the creation of independent advisory body. This was really an innovation of the UK Climate Change Act, which has since been picked up around the world by many other countries. So the Climate Change Committee is a group of experts, about 7 or 8 in the core, which are supported by the professional secretariat. In the secretariat, there are about 30 people, and it's a full-time organization. The mandate of the Climate Change Committee is firstly to recommend the level of carbon budgets, as I mentioned, to the government. And what is very important, the government cannot just ignore the recommendation. They have to respond to it formally, which makes the status of Climate Change Committee much more legitimate and much more prominent in the process of implementing the legislation. The second mandate of the Climate Change Committee is to monitor progress on emission reductions and on adaptation in the UK. So the Climate Change Act mandates the government, the Secretary of State responsible for implementation of climate and energy policy. It mandates them every year to come up with a progress report on emissions, on greenhouse gas emissions in the UK. And that report then goes to the Climate Change Committee for scrutiny and comments and is then presented in front of the Parliament. So Parliament plays a very important role in the accountability of government, keeping government accountable for implementation of the legislation. But Climate Change Committee is the main technical body which provides assessment of how is the government and how is the UK economy doing in terms of meeting the objectives, the emission reduction targets that are set on the carbon budgets, and also meeting the objectives on climate resilience and adaptation. So effectively, when we conducted our study to understand what impact has legislation played and how it achieved it, one of the conclusions was that independent advisory body, the Climate Change Committee, has played a central role in ensuring effectiveness of climate legislation. And effectively, in the 10 years of Climate Change Act being in place, they became a trusted advisor, which is being used not just by the government, but actually across the whole political spectrum in the UK. And I'll give you a little bit more detail on that shortly. So a little bit more detail for you on how the Climate Change Committee operates. So the members of Climate Change Committee, as I said, are experts acting on their personal expert capacity, but they are appointed by the government. Importantly, they don't represent any political party. So the choice of experts is not driven by trying to achieve the balance coming from different political parties or different types of stakeholders. No, it's only based on technical merit. And so when we look at the backgrounds, technical background of current Climate Change Committee members, you can see that they cover amongst them, some of them cover different perspectives. So you have technology and engineering, food and agriculture, economics, climate science, and more recently behavioral sciences as well as natural environment. In terms of where experts are, where do they come from in terms of their affiliation? So the majority of them have background in academia. Some of them also have background in business or NGOs, and one member, which happens to be the current chair of the Climate Change Committee, which is Lord Deben. He's a politician, but it's rather a coincidence. He wasn't chosen to be the chair because of his political career. He was chosen again on his personal merits. Now, the Climate Change Committee has a sizable annual budget. This is very important because I can mention examples of other countries such as Mexico, which created an independent advisory body, the Council on Climate Change, C3, but they forgot to give it any budget. So the UK's Climate Change Committee has a budget of 3.7 million, which allows them to undertake studies themselves, but also to commission additional work if they need additional expertise, which is very important. They have a very high-profile chairman, as I said, Lord Dibben. He's very active politically in the House of Lords. And as I mentioned, the Climate Change Committee has very clear statutory responsibilities, which are outlined in the climate change legislation itself. Again, comparing UK's experience to that of Mexico and to some extent of France, having these very clear responsibilities and mandates written in the law, and in particular having this requirement for the government to respond to the recommendations of the Climate Change Committee, it has been a critical success factor of the impact that the committee has had on the UK climate policy. Because oftentimes, and that's for example the case in Mexico, the independent advisory body could issue a report, a study, or recommendation. But if the government is not obliged by legislation to respond to it, those recommendations oftentimes just remain on paper and do not enter the political debate. And finally, the Climate Change Committee has its own subcommittee, which focuses on adaptation specifically. It's called Subcommittee on Adaptation. Now, I mentioned a few minutes ago that we have looked at the role specifically of Climate Change Committee in advancing UK's climate change policy. So to understand that, we have asked a question of, to what extent the information produced by Climate Change Committee and the advice it makes to the government actually enters a political debate, so the debate in the government and in the parliament. So what we've done to answer that question, we have looked at the records, written records of all parliamentary debates, all speeches made in parliament in the past 10 years that mentioned climate change in one way or another. And in those speeches and debates, we looked for references to the information produced by Climate Change Committee. What we found in that research is that out of all citations and out of all discussions related to climate change, information produced by the UK Climate Change Committee was cited by parliamentarians 5 times more often than the information produced by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, by IPCC. So effectively, climate change related information produced by the independent advisory body in the UK became the primary source of authority on climate change when the issue is being discussed in Parliament. What is also very interesting, we analyze the data by political party, and it's not just, say, Labour or Green Party, which would rely on the information by Climate Change Committee. Conservative Party and other parties in the Parliament have also actively referred to the information by Climate Change Committee. So it is really not, the information provided is not being seen as political, it's being seen as independent authoritative analysis. Another interesting conclusion that we have come to is that information from Climate Change Committee has not only been used in the context of climate change debate, so the discussions on the level of the targets or carbon budgets, or in the discussion of progress towards implementation of carbon budgets and reducing emissions or adaptation. The information produced by Climate Change Committee actually entered discussions on other legislation which relates to climate change, but really primarily targets sectoral discussions. And this is this chart on the left bottom corner that you can see. So what it really shows is that out of all sittings in the Parliament, for example, on energy bills, so on energy bills, 40 or over 35% of all sittings on that legislation actually included information from the Climate Change Committee. So what we're really seeing is that the climate change as an issue and climate change policy and the information related to it produced by Climate Change Committee penetrates other sectoral discussions in the UK on energy, on infrastructure bill, on civil aviation, on water, even on Brexit, on housing and planning, on enterprise and regulation reform bill, which is effectively what a comprehensive climate change policy and response to climate change needs to achieve. It needs to achieve mainstreaming of climate concern into the relevant sectoral discussions. What we can see is that Climate Change Committee has played a central role in ensuring that mainstreaming, because the information they produced has been relevant and useful in the context of these legislative processes. We can talk more about it in the question and answer session. I'm just giving you some highlights here. Now, having looked at other countries that have followed the example of the UK and established a climate change independent advisory body, specifically we looked at the experience of Mexico, also at the experience of France, at the Germany and a few other countries. This chart here shows the key success factors for how independent advisory body becomes effective. So first of all, it's important to have a clear mandate in the climate change legislation, which outlines responsibilities, but also the powers of the climate change advisory body. Secondly, as I mentioned, it's important to have accountability mechanism for the government. So the government needs to be mandated to take into account the advice that the independent advisory body provides. And even better if they can, if they are mandated to publicly respond to it. In the UK, we know the government actually has a table where they track recommendations that the Climate Change Committee has made, and then they track their response to it. And if they haven't followed a particular response, they have to appear in front of Parliament and specify why a particular recommendation hasn't been followed. And so far, recommendations on carbon budgets have been followed to the letter, where we have seen some deviation. Sometimes certain recommendations were not picked up, were in relation to specific policies and to the calls on making accounting rules around emission reductions more tight. For example, not allowing banking of overachievement of emission reductions achieved in particular periods to the other carbon budgets, which is what a Climate Change Committee has argued. Also, the recommendation to include the emissions of aviation has not yet been followed through, but these are just the two examples of the most contentious recommendations that haven't been acted upon yet. The rest has so far been followed by the government. The first success factor, it's important to allocate funding to the independent advisory body in order for it to be effective, and that funding needs to be predictable and sustainable over time. Fourthly, the climate change advisory body needs to have high level of technical expertise, and it needs to be seen as independent from the government financially and administratively. In the UK, administratively that's the case. Financially, not quite, because the budget for the Climate Change Committee is being provided through the climate change relevant climate change ministries, that is a potential weakness. And finally, it is key to have parliamentary oversight built into the whole mechanism, so that the information provided by the Climate Change Advisory Body goes to Parliament, and that recommendations and response to those recommendations by the government are also seen in public and debated on in the Parliament. Now, if we look at the 10 years of Climate Change Act being in place in the UK, I started the talk asking, what difference has it made? Has it made any difference? And if so, what difference did it make? So we have interviewed 33 very senior experts in the UK, former and current politicians directly involved in the climate change policy. We also talked to journalists, to businessmen, private sector representatives, to NGOs and think tanks to get their perspectives on that question. And based on those interviews, we were able to identify 4 areas where climate change legislation in the UK has made a tangible impact. The first type of impact is that we have heard from experts that having gone through the adoption of the legislation and having a legislation in place, the quality of the debate on climate change, a political debate, meaning debate in the government and in parliament, has significantly improved. The climate legislation has, by setting the target and the long-term objective, has lifted the baseline from which the conversation on climate change starts in the UK politics to the level where it's not about should we do something on climate change, how much should we reduce our emissions, rather to the question of, okay, we have that target to reach, how should we do it? And that has been made huge qualitative difference in terms of how the government and politicians approach the issue. Secondly, by creating clear timelines when carbon budgets needs to be adopted, when UK government needs to report on the progress with implementation of carbon budgets, when the new plan for how carbon budget will be met through the set of policies needs to be published, that creates a clear timeline for the media to write about climate change and for the political environment to take on the issue. So the parliament has a very clear schedule on when they have to look at it. The second impact relates to the strengthening and maintaining the consensus around the importance of action on climate change. While, as I mentioned, the commitment of different governments in the office, and we had 5 governments now in power since 2008, 5 times the government has changed. The commitment of different government offices to climate issue has varied. The UK is still committed to the overall long-term target and is implementing policies to meet it. However, lately we have seen some challenges with government delaying the presentation of plans for specific policies to reduce emissions, and Climate Change Committee has also criticized the government in terms of the latest plan for implementing 4th carbon budget and 5th carbon budget as being too weak and potentially not sufficient to meet the target. So we'll have to see how that unfolds. But so far the consensus has held. Thirdly, Climate Change Act has strengthened UK's position as a leader internationally and inspired others to act. So at every climate change negotiation sessions, at every mission outside where UK government talks on climate and environment, Climate Change Act is seen as a really important example and an area that other countries can learn from. And finally, which is what we really care about, are the emission reductions. So I have to say it's very hard to attribute emission reductions to the legislation alone, because in particular in the case of the UK, but also in the case of all countries really, it's not just the legislation, but it's rather the quality and effectiveness of underlying policies which will lead to emission reductions. So in the past 2 decades, basically between 1990 and 2016, UK's emissions have gone down by 40%, while gross domestic product in the same period has increased by 70%, which is quite an impressive track record of decarbonization. But where climate legislation has played a particular role, according to the expert interviews we conducted, is in promoting the uptake of renewable energy and enabling a really fast rate of transformation in terms of switch to renewables from 20% of the energy mix at the time the Climate Change Act was adopted to 45% by 2018 when the Act celebrated 10 years. So I would like to leave sufficient time for questions and comments. So let me skip a couple of slides, and I just wanted to show you this one to summarize. This infographic shows the key elements that a country should consider when developing a climate change legislation. We talked about some of those elements in more detail, such as emission reduction targets to 2050 and the mechanism of arriving to that long-term target, which ideally should be net zero or more ambitious in the context of European Union's emission reduction commitment. The carbon budgets mechanism has not just been implemented in the UK, France has also adopted it now in its domestic legislation. Independent advisory body and the clear specification of mandates for the key agencies and statutory timelines for the key decisions to be taken, and very clear parliamentary oversight. Couple of points we haven't touched upon is that it's important to, in particular for countries which are federal, have federal system, to just define the role of subnational governments and municipalities, at least to provide some guidance to them, or determine the division of powers and responsibilities between federal and subnational level. To determine stakeholder engagement mechanism, some countries like France create a specific stakeholder engagement mechanism through their climate legislation. Others, like UK, use established stakeholder engagement mechanisms that work across different policy areas through submissions and engagement forums. Again, Slovenia would need to see what is more appropriate in your local context in that sense. Then some climate laws, for example, France and Mexico, they don't just establish economy-wide emission reduction targets, but they also specify sectoral objectives. Again, there is a trade-off, as I said, between being very prescriptive and very specific to being more flexible, and there are different political feasibilities associated with that and political costs in terms of time it will take to negotiate a more detailed legislation. Mechanisms for risk assessment and adaptation planning, and monitoring and progress, monitoring and review of progress. One area I haven't touched upon, and I'll just spend a minute on it, is this one in the bottom corner, right-hand corner, which is risk disclosure for investors and asset managers. UK climate change law did not have that and does not have that yet as part of its framework. The first country to establish that in the world was France in its energy transition law, and they really acted here on the recommendation of the International Task Force on Financial Disclosure, which suggested that it is very important to give a signal to investors and to indicate very clearly which investments are highly vulnerable because of the projected impacts of climate change, but also which investments are not sustainable in terms of being high carbon assets, so assets based on fossil fuels, which really have no place in the future if we are to move towards decarbonization. So France has introduced in their legislation mandatory requirements for risk disclosure for investors and asset managers. And I think this is a very interesting and very important element to consider going forward. And I know Spain, for example, in their draft law is looking at including that into their national legislation. So I will stop there. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm happy to go into more detail on any of these points. And here are some underlying publications that you can look up to get more details on any of the aspects that I have just discussed. Thank you.
Alina, thank you again for this very insightful presentation. Now it's time for questions, for comments, discussion. We unfortunately have just a little bit of time, but if there are any questions, you can also just unmute yourself and ask a question. So maybe to break the ice, I have a question because we've been talking a lot about transferring of good practices, but what are some of the negative experiences from other climate laws that we can also draw from when drafting new climate laws? You have mentioned some of them, but are there any other really important mistakes that have been made? Or
I think one mistake, even, one learning from the UK's Climate Change Act, which is being praised as one of the best models. One mistake, I think, of the Climate Change Act is that I've explained that it requires the government to, so when the carbon budget is set, the target for each 5-year period, the government then is obliged to come up with a detailed plan of policies that they will introduce in order to meet that carbon budget, that target, which is fine. But the mistake was not to specify by when should the government develop that plan. And so what happens is that the legislation says as soon as practical. And practical can be in 1 month, can be in 6 months, or can be years after the climate change, the targets have been established, the carbon budgets. So I would say that for other countries that are looking at more flexible approach, similar to the UK, where not all of the targets are specified right away in the main legislation, be very precise on timelines and be very specific by when what needs to happen. In addition to that, I think I've mentioned the importance of having strong parliamentary oversight, which were mistakes, which were shortcomings of some of the laws that we have looked at, and also to have a mandatory requirement for the government to respond to the independent recommendations by the advisory body.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Katyusha. What about the integration of long-term and short-term policies and goals? How to ensure this is as effective as possible?
So in the again, in the UK model, the specific policies, so the legislation identifies the long-term goal and the intermediate goals for each 5-year period of time for the carbon budgets. The integration of policies then happens at the level of the plan that the government develops to show how they're going to implement and ensure that the short-term objectives are met. And then the Climate Change Committee also provides independent assessment at the time then the short-term goals are established, the carbon budgets, whether they are compatible with the long-term objective. So just to make it very concrete, now we have a net zero target by 2050. So in the discussion of the next carbon budget, the Climate Change Committee, when they propose the level of emission reduction targets, in their analysis, they will take into account the need to get to net zero by 2050 and adjust their proposal accordingly. Then the government, when they develop the set of policies and present the plan for implementation of the carbon budget, they would then need to ensure that the short-term policies that they're proposing and the medium-term policies will be sufficient for reaching the objective set in the carbon budget. Again, does this mechanism work in practice? So far it has been working up until very recently, where the Climate Change Committee itself pointed out that the proposals for policies presented by the government, they may not be sufficient to reach the emission reduction objectives. So in the UK context, then this discussion goes to Parliament, and there is a pressure put on the government to be more ambitious in terms of policies that they are putting in place. If at the end of carbon budget reporting period, it comes to the actual emissions being above what they should be, there is a possibility for judicial review. That has never happened in the UK yet, so effectively the government can be brought to court. It hasn't happened yet in the UK in the context of climate policy because so far the emission reductions were complying with the targets mandated through the legislation. So we'll have to see, but this is effectively the mechanism, and I believe the government will do all they can to not face a judicial review, because that is a very embarrassing and politically costly process for the government. Dasha, I can't hear you for some reason. I don't know if others can.
Yeah, sorry, I'm muted. Yeah, I was just making sure if there are any other questions, because I haven't seen any in the chat right now. So if anyone has something to ask, you can, as I said before, you can also unmute yourself and just ask the question. But if there are no questions, I think that we can also end this webinar. Let's wait for a few seconds, I guess. But anyways, thank you, Alina, very, very much. This was a really great presentation in the time of drafting our own climate law. I think that we can learn a lot from already existing practices. So thank you for this very brief presentation. And as I said, if that's it, I mean, do you maybe have something else to add, or?
Well, I think it's very important what you're going through, both in terms of Slovenia's domestic policy, but also your leadership and upcoming leadership in the context of the EU, of course. So if later on, you have questions, those who were on this webinar, you thought of some questions that you wish you'd asked, or new questions arise, feel free to get in touch with us. We'll be happy to share, our knowledge and also the materials on different studies that we have made. So just an invitation to be in touch, really.
Okay, thank you very much. So let's end it here. Thank you again. And as Alina said, you can write directly to her or write to me or to Focus. And just to let you know, as I said before, this was just the first in the series of webinars. So make sure to check our Facebook site and page for updated information regarding upcoming events. So thank you, everyone, and hope to see you on the other webinars.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.